Winter in the 1300s was not a season, it was a sentence. The cold didn't simply arrive, it settled quietly and refused to leave. The first snow was beautiful, yes. Children laughed, farmers paused their plows, and the village looked like something out of a story. But beauty fades fast when the cold keeps coming and firewood runs out. By January, the world was silent. The rivers froze into glass. The wells were sealed shut by ice. Even the breath of animals hung motionless in the air. Inside homes, people woke to find frost blooming on their blankets like tiny white flowers. The walls of stone that had once felt strong now radiated cold, as if the entire house had joined the winter's conspiracy. There was no central heating, no insulated windows, no roaring furnace to rely on. The only warmth came from the body, your own, or if you were lucky, someone else's beside you. The cold was not just outside, it crept into the bones, into the will to move, to speak, to think. It made people quiet, not from peace, but from survival. They adapted, of course. They always did. People learned to sleep earlier, move less, and talk softly to conserve energy. They sealed gaps with cloth and hay. They kept their animals close, not out of affection, but necessity. A cow's breath could raise the temperature of a room. The days blurred into a long gray dream, broken only by the faint hope that spring, one day, would remember to return. And so they endured, wrapped in hay, faith, and the stubborn belief that the sun would find its way back. In the world before radiators, survival was not about comfort. It was about learning how to stay warm without fire and how to stay human in the cold. If you ever stepped inside a house in the 1300s, you'd quickly realize that indoors didn't mean warm. Stone walls trapped cold as much as they kept out wind. The floor, made of packed dirt or rough wood, breathed frost from below. When the night came, the house turned into a cave of chill, silent, dim, and alive with the whisper of winter pressing against the walls. There was no comfort as we know it, no carpets, no insulation, no soft couches waiting by a fire. People wrapped themselves in layers of wool, fur, and whatever scraps they could find. Smoke from the hearth drifted through the air, curling under the low ceiling beams. It didn't always go up the chimney. Sometimes it just stayed, hanging thick like a ghost that never left. The air smelled of damp straw, soot, and soup, if there was any. Children and animals often shared the same floor, the same breath, and sometimes the same blanket. A cow might sleep in one corner, chickens in another. The humans in between, huddled close, spoke little. There was something sacred about the quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes from conserving breath. People learned to live with the cold, to see it not as an intruder, but as a roommate who demanded respect. You couldn't fight winter, you could only negotiate with it. The trick was not to defeat the cold, but to outlast it. So they sat by the dim light of a candle, their faces glowing gold while their shadows shivered on the wall. It wasn't warmth that kept them alive. It was patience, and maybe a stubborn sense of humor. After all, when everything freezes, laughter is one of the few things that can still thaw the air. When the world gives you hay, you make a blanket. It sounds absurd now, but in the 1300s, hay wasn't just for animals. It was the medieval equivalent of a down comforter, warm, scratchy, and everywhere. People learned to stuff hay into anything that could hold it, mattresses, sheets, even their own clothes. The result was far from comfortable, but compared to freezing to death, a few itchy nights seemed like a small price to pay. Some even layered hay between old fabrics, creating what they fondly called poor man's bedding. It rustled every time you moved, so subtlety was out of the question. But warmth? That it gave generously. The smell of dry hay filled the air, earthy, honest, and strangely comforting. In a time before soap was common, that scent was the closest thing to freshness. Children slept nestled in hay piles beside the hearth, like small animals burrowed in a nest. In the flickering candlelight, the golden strands looked almost holy, glowing like threads of stubborn hope. But hay wasn't just bedding. It was insulation, wall padding, even life insurance. People packed it between wooden planks, under rugs and inside boots. Some poor souls even joked that if the cold didn't kill them, the fleas living in the hay would. But they laughed anyway, because laughter, like warmth, was something you could make yourself. It's easy to romanticize it now, the image of rustic cottages and golden straw beds. But for them, it was survival at its most inventive. No luxury, no softness, only the simple miracle that a handful of grass could keep a body warm through the night. And in that small, humble act, you can almost hear humanity whispering to the cold. You can have the world winter, but tonight we keep the warmth. In winter, the human body was the cheapest source of heat and the most reliable. So people shared it, not out of romance, but necessity. Families, servants, even guests, everyone squeezed into the same bed. Warmth, as they said, was a community project. Beds were rarely big enough. 3, 4, sometimes 5 people would lie shoulder to shoulder under layers of cloth and straw, wrapped together like a single living bundle. The idea of personal space didn't exist, not because they didn't value it, but because the frost didn't care about your boundaries. Survival required closeness, both physical and emotional. The nights were long and conversations short. Sometimes they whispered stories until sleep came. Stories about summer, about green fields and sunlight. The bed became a fragile island of warmth in a sea of cold. And though the air outside froze, inside that shared space, there was life, laughter, and even love. Not the kind sung by poets, but the quiet, practical kind that kept everyone alive. Of course, there were complaints. Someone always snored, someone stole the blanket, someone's cold feet found your leg at 2 in the morning, but no one kicked them out, because if they left, the cold would come rushing in to fill the space they left behind. You learned to forgive quickly in winter. Sometimes even travelers or beggars were invited to share a corner of the bed. It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. The more bodies, the more heat. And in that strange, humble closeness, humanity rediscovered something profound. That warmth wasn't just about temperature, it was about connection. The world outside was frozen, silent, and hostile. But under one blanket, people became each other's fire. No one survived winter alone. If winter was an enemy, then fire was the only ally humankind had left. A trembling, flickering ally, small enough to die with a careless breath, yet strong enough to save an entire family. Keeping the fire alive was a sacred duty. Every home had one hearth, one fragile heart of warmth. It wasn't just wood and flame, it was life itself. People guarded it like a newborn child. Before bed, they covered the embers with ash, whispering small prayers that it would still glow by dawn. Because if it didn't, morning would come cold and cruel. To start a new fire meant striking flint on steel, a slow, stubborn ritual that could take hours with frozen hands. So the flame was never allowed to die. Someone always kept watch. In many villages, families passed small, glowing coals from one home to another, an act that was half kindness, half survival. Fire, they said, is the only thing worth sharing before dawn. The smell of smoke hung everywhere, woven into clothing, hair, and even dreams. People learned to love it because smoke meant life. The walls were blackened, the ceiling dark, but no one complained. A dark room was warmer than a clean one. At night, the flicker of the fire painted golden light across tired faces. Children huddled around it, tracing shapes in the ash, while parents stared silently into the glow, as if watching time itself breathe. Fire demanded constant attention, constant humility. It was never truly theirs. It was borrowed from the world, a gift from something greater. And when the flames crackled and the shadows danced, people saw more than heat. They saw a miracle repeating itself every night. If warmth was scarce in winter, food was even rarer. The earth slept under snow, silent and stingy. What remained were cellars of roots, jars of grain, and whatever could be stretched into something edible. People became artists of survival, turning almost nothing into dinner. Soup was the most democratic meal. Everyone, rich or poor, had some version of it. It began with water, always water, and then whatever the house could spare, a potato, a piece of onion, maybe a bone that had seen better days. Some called it broth, others, hope. The pot simmered all day over a low flame, releasing warmth that felt almost like kindness. The smell of soup filled the room, humble but comforting. It wasn't abundance that made it precious, but the effort behind it. People would dip stale bread into the thin liquid and chew slowly, as if tasting patience itself. On good days, there might be cabbage. On bad days, just salt and stories. Preservation was an art. Meat was salted, fish dried, apples hung from rafters like ornaments of survival. Every bite in winter was a memory of summer. The sweetness of a single carrot could make someone close their eyes just to remember sunlight. And yet no one complained too loudly. There was humor in hardship. Someone always joked that soup without meat had extra imagination. Children giggled as they stirred empty pots, pretending it was a feast. In those small, playful moments, warmth returned, not from the hearth, but from the heart. So yes, they made food from nothing, but in doing so, they made something else too, gratitude. Because when you live through hunger, every flavor is a miracle, even if that flavor is mostly water. When the cold bit too deep and the fire's warmth no longer reached the bones, people turned to remedies, half medicine, half superstition. Garlic hung from rafters like ancient amulets. A sip of honeyed wine was said to chase winter from the blood. Mothers rubbed their children's chests with goose fat, believing it sealed warmth inside the body. And if all else failed, there were prayers, whispered not to God exactly, but to the season itself, as if winter could be bargained with. Herbalists and wise women brewed strange concoctions, dried nettles for blood flow, elderberry for the cough, a dash of vinegar to wake the soul. In a world without doctors for miles, the village healer was equal parts chemist, philosopher, and witch. Her hut smelled of herbs, smoke, and faint hope, the scent of defiance against the frost. People didn't just treat the body, they soothed the spirit. Some placed iron nails by the window to ward off winter demons. Others tied red strings around their wrists, believing warmth was a thing of the heart as much as the flesh. The rituals were odd, but they gave comfort. And comfort in the 1300s was often the best medicine available. Around the hearth, stories grew like vines, tales of spirits who froze the wicked, of travelers who followed candlelight home through the blizzard. Some stories scared children into staying near the fire. Others reminded them that warmth was not just something you made, but something you shared. The line between medicine and myth was thin, but both kept people alive. Maybe that's the secret of the Middle Ages. They fought cold not just with fire, but with faith. In a time before science, belief itself was a kind of heat. The nights in winter were not measured in hours. They were measured in patience. Once the sun sank behind the hills, darkness didn't visit. It moved in. The world shrank to the size of a single candle flame, and everything beyond that soft circle of light was unknowable, or worse, imagined. People spoke softly, if at all. The crackle of fire and the creak of wood were the night's only conversation. The long hours were filled with simple rituals, mending clothes, carving spoons, weaving wool. Every task was done slowly, with a kind of quiet dignity, as if rushing might wake the cold waiting outside. Children drifted to sleep by the hearth, lulled by the rhythm of the flames. Their parents sat nearby, whispering stories passed down from generations, tales of spirits, heroes, and summer days that felt like another lifetime. The stories were not just to entertain, they were to remember warmth when warmth was gone. Time moved differently in winter. The clock was replaced by the sound of logs splitting or the sigh of wind against the shutters. Some nights there was laughter, soft, tired, but real. Someone might hum a tune. Someone else might share the last bit of bread. In those hours, the darkness became less of a threat and more of a companion, vast, silent, but gentle enough to listen. For all its coldness, winter had a way of slowing the world down until people noticed the small things, the glow of embers, the breath of a loved one, the peace that only comes when there is nothing left to chase. The nights were long, yes, but they were also full of stories, of faith, of tiny stubborn light that refused to go out. In the heart of winter, when the world was silent and cruel, faith became the fire people couldn't let go out. The church, cold as stone, was still a refuge. Its walls echoed with prayers, soft and trembling like candlelight. People gathered there, not only to worship, but to feel less alone. The sound of footsteps on frozen floors, the rustle of wool cloaks, the faint scent of wax and smoke, all of it blended into a fragile kind of warmth. There was no grand sermon, no promise of miracles, just voices, human voices, lifted together against the cold. A hymn sung slowly could warm the air more than any hearth. When the candles flickered on the altar, their flames reflected in hundreds of tired eyes, each one a tiny spark of hope, refusing to die. Faith was not only about God, it was about each other, about the belief that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to light a candle for you. In villages buried under snow, that was enough to keep the soul from freezing. Sometimes the priest would visit homes where the fire had gone out. He brought not just holy water, but news, a reminder that the world still existed beyond the storm. Even the sound of a knock on the door felt like salvation. To believe in such a world was an act of defiance, Every prayer was a rebellion against despair. And so they prayed, not always for spring, but simply for strength. Because in the long winter, faith wasn't about waiting for the world to warm. It was about keeping your own heart from turning to ice. Spring didn't arrive with trumpets. It crept in softly, a drip from the roof, a thawing path, a bird foolish enough to sing before sunrise. People didn't cheer when they first noticed. They just paused, listened, and breathed a little deeper. After months of biting wind and frozen air, the smallest change felt enormous. The sun, faint and pale, touched the walls that had long been cold. The river began to hum again beneath the ice. Children ran outside barefoot too early, because joy, like spring, doesn't always wait for permission. Inside homes, the fires burned lower, but hearts burned brighter. The hay beds were shaken out, the blankets aired, the windows cracked open just enough to let in the smell of earth. Wet, living, forgiving. People smiled more, not because life became easy, but because they had survived what was hardest. The poor were still poor, the nights were still cold, but there was color again, in cheeks, in fields, in faith. And maybe that was enough. When you live without heating, you learn that warmth isn't a machine or a luxury, it's an instinct. It's the way hands find each other under one blanket, the way people share soup, stories, silence, the way the heart insists on beating, even when the world tells it to stop. Hope, they learn, was not a miracle that came after suffering. It was the quiet, stubborn thing that refused to die during it. And so, as the last of the frost melted and the first green returned, they looked around their small, smoky homes and smiled, tired, proud, and human. They had outlasted the winter, not with power, but with patience, not with comfort, but with connection. And when the night came again, they knew the truth that had carried them through all along. You don't need to conquer the cold. You just need to keep the warmth alive inside you.